Hello, good evening and welcome to UPfront. Today, we continue our celebration of a glorious life, a man who put Ghana on the map everywhere in the world. The late UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. I'll tell you my guest after this break because he is a great man in his own right. And we have a conversation on the life, his experience with the man, and the legacy of Mr. Annan. You're welcome back. My name is Raymond Alqua. This is UPfront. And UPfront today is in a solemn mood, celebrating the life of one man who embodies the Ghanaian excellence that has been talked about over a very long time. Well, Kofi Annan lived a good life. This is perhaps the last day that he'll be laid in state because tomorrow his burial will happen. And all of the funeral put together as a state for him may be concluded tomorrow. Beyond what has been talked about by many who may know him in different and varied forms, one man who hardly speaks but has a lot of wisdom and power in his voice when he does so is Ambassador Dike Osei. I'm sure you might have known that he was secretary to the former president J.A. Kufuor, but you sure should be able to know that he's also an ambassador of extraordinary competence. He's been to places, so he's been ambassador to Denmark, to the Scandinavian countries. He's also occupied several other positions. Some time back, he was ambassador in residence at the Lagos Center for International Affairs and Democracy. Ambassador Dike Osei, you're welcome.
Thank you.
I hope you are doing well.
Well, I'm getting there.
It's been a long time since you were seen very active in the public space.
I've never really been very active in the public space. Even when I was secretary to president, yeah. I rarely got active in the public space because I'm a civil servant, public servant. So we, like Kofi, we like to hide.
Interesting, interesting. But I mean, I was talking about you've not been at places. I mean, the places that usually you are seen engaging.
I haven't been very well.
Okay.
I haven't been very well.
We hope you are in good health.
Oh,
now.
I'm getting better.
Wonderful.
I'm getting better. I'm glad to be back in full.
And we are glad to have you today.
Thank you.
It's an honor to us to have you join us on today's event.
Thank
now,
you.
let me start from this because people have, and this is a man who at a point in time virtually ran the world.
Absolutely.
So he's had so many different experiences with different people.
Absolutely.
Of international repute and different varied life. But let's start on a personal basis. How did you know Kofi Annan? When did that relationship start for you?
Oh, the relationship started a long time ago because Uncle Kofi's father and my father worked in the same company, in the same office.
Oh, sir.
Young executives in the UAC. UAC later became Unilever. So Uncle Kofi's father used to come to our house and our father used to go to his house. That's how the two families became very friendly. Then subsequently, later in my career, you recall that under President Rawlings, several teams were formed to campaign for its position as Secretary General. The first team was led by Dr. Obeda Samoa, the second by Ambassador Victor Behu. The third was by Dr. Chambers, and I was in the third team. And we visited dozens of countries. But at each point, we had to brief him on how the campaign was going, what we thought his chances were. That got me very close to him.
Okay.
Then thirdly, when I became Secretary to President, President Kufuor needed a focal point for our relations with the UN, African Union, and ECOWAS, and he made me the local point. So all our dealings with the UN came through me.
I see.
Unfortunately, his Director of African Affairs, Ambassador Hayford, was a very good friend of mine from the Foreign Ministry. So we were literally on a daily basis, we're in touch about events in Africa, events in the world, what Ghana's position would be, and what we thought about things that were, and so on. So but from then, we worked so closely that after I had worked with him on the Cote d'Ivoire crisis, he actually offered me a job as a special representative in Cote d'Ivoire.
I see.
And President Kufuor said, well, to hell, it's going to appoint you anyway. He didn't tolerate it at all.
Okay.
But that's how close we got.
Okay, that's interesting. We'll explore that part because that Cote d'Ivoire experience is very interesting.
It is.
Of course, I mean, I'm given to understand that you had to sometimes go by vehicle to places that were very interesting in Ivory Coast. We'll talk about that too in the course of our conversation.
Right.
But let's take it from the beginning, where you said you had childhood experience with Mr. Kofi Annan.
Yes.
Your parents worked in the same office.
That's right. You know, when we were taken along with my father, Kofi was older. He used to come in and out, but he always sat very quietly in the corner. But his brother Kobna, who later became ambassador in Morocco, was the one who we really engaged with. Kofi was very, very quiet, but we knew him then very casually. But later in life when we met, he called and reminded me that, you know, I was a little naughty boy who used to come with my father and so on and so forth. Very quiet person. I
see. So your experience with him, was he the way we see him now? Was he that calm, reposed, not so much of a hawk or so much of a person who is always seen as somebody who's hot-headed?
I've always dealt with him professionally. And as a practitioner, I can tell you it's very rare to see a diplomat who never gets ruffled. And Kofi never got ruffled. I've seen him in very difficult situations. He was always calm and very well-mannered, but also very firm. In fact, I've seen him in situations where he has scolded heads of states in a polite manner which nobody else would have dared to do. I mean, I remember at an AU summit in Durban, there was a time when Mubarak and Compaoré and Bongo and Sassou Nguesso,
I see.
They were all in power. Then he stood before them and gave them a lecture about democracy and about
all the long-standing dictators on the continent.
Tunisia, all of them were there. And the boldness which he told them of really surprised me. So even though he's always remained calm and unruffled, when the need arose, I found him very firm. I tell another story. In the second negotiations in the Cote d'Ivoire crisis, President Kofi asked him to come and chair, because we really had got to a point when the government of Seydou Diarra wasn't doing too well and he wanted somebody of stature to take over. The president of Congo-Brazzaville, Sassou Nguesso, was invited. So was President Bongo. And you know, President Bongo was married to Sassou's daughter, who was a doctor, Edith. So they were very close, and they were sitting next to each other. And during the negotiation, they kept talking all the time. You know, at that time, very few heads of state dared talk to Bongo. So I remember the Secretary General telling them and said, look, gentlemen, I am in charge here. I have only one meeting. If you want to talk, can you just get out of here? I have never seen anybody talk to President Bongo like that. And that was it. They didn't utter a word from that point. So he was very calm, but very balanced, but very firm too.
That's interesting to know. Now, in the diplomatic circles,
that's right,
you'd have somebody of his sort rising through the ranks of the UN. And was it strange, mindful of his personal attributes, was it strange then that he could become the Secretary General?
I think it surprised everybody. And in a certain sense, destiny helped him, because from the earlier periods of his career, it was mostly in administrative jobs. It was towards the end that he was moved to peacekeeping operations. Yeah. So in effect, he had not done a lot of the political work. Again, it was when UN officials were trapped in Iraq that he was asked to go and evacuate them, which brought him close to the real political action.
I see.
Now, in the circumstances, the US was desperate not to have Boutros Ghali continue his term. And the US was determined to find somebody. And very strangely, in the circles of the State Department, the only name which came up then, I don't know why, was Kofi Annan.
I see.
So throughout the whole campaign, the difficulties we had was with France, because France swore not to allow America to have its own way. So all the way along the way, France was backing Boutros. In fact, because of that, the Security Council vote took place several times before eventually, behind the scenes negotiations allowed France to vote in favor of Kofi.
The claim has been made that he was a choice of the United States of America because they disliked Boutros Ghali so much. And some in North Africa felt, why would an African be interested in replacing another African, mindful of the relationship the West, specifically the US, had with this African, Boutros Ghali?
You see, I think the main criticism against Boutros was that he concentrated too much on only African issues. And as Secretary General, I think you ought to understand that you represent all nations. And even though he had difficulties with the Americans, that was not the only reason. And let me add that perhaps after his election, the Secretary General Kofi Annan had even more problems with American establishment.
Yes, that was later on.
That's right.
Yeah.
And again, in diplomacy, it was obvious that Americans were not going to vote for Boutros Ghali. And Africa did not want to lose the position. So it was important that if Boutros was not going to win, Africa should come together to find an appropriate replacement. In fact, we consulted the Egyptian president. I remember when we arrived in Cairo, the Egyptians were so angry that they were not going to receive us. But when we left and we were just about to board the plane, President Mubarak sent a vehicle through the back doors of Cairo, and the meeting went very well. His response was that, look, listen, we back our boy, but in case the Supreme Security Council decides that they will not vote for him, we will support Kofi Annan. So we had done sufficient work for them to understand that we're not anti-Boutros, but it was important for Africa, an African, to replace an African, so that we didn't lose our opportunity of an African continuing as Secretary General.
Tell me about this, and to all intents and purposes, it sounds like deep politicking for diplomats in this particular case. I mean, with the kind of people that were involved in the attempt to make sure that he stays in office and all of that,
right.
How difficult was it having to sell a man who's been, especially when he had come head on with reforms that some people did not like?
I think that he came out as a good candidate for a number of reasons.
Okay.
He was perceived as being a very neutral international civil servant with no strong opinions on issues international. In other words, you could trust him not to toe any ideological positions.
I see.
But to find solutions to problems, which is basically what they were looking for.
He had no ideological position.
I don't think that he did.
He was not a capitalist?
I suspect that he had respect for liberal economic policies.
Oh, okay.
But to say that he was a capitalist, I don't know that, because if you look at the MDGs and so on, his fight for AIDS, and
it sounded more to the left. Yeah.
So that's right. And that's a lot. That's what most efficient international civil servants do. You want to solve problems. You want to find solutions. And I thought he was perceived as a good person who would do the right things for all countries.
I see. Now, you talk about Egypt, which was going to be difficult not to crack along the line. But which other countries gave this team of yours a very hard time in your quest to make sure that you make Kofi Annan stay in office?
In the beginning, a number of Francophone African countries.
Francophone.
And of course, with the support of France. Because
okay, that's interesting.
France had gone public to state that they would not support Kofi Annan, that they would support Boutros Ghali. And President Chirac was on the phone constantly harassing the US president to support Boutros.
I see.
And once France took that position, a number of Francophone African countries toed the line. What we then decided to do was to then deal with those African countries. In fact, in the end, in the process of trying to change the position of France, we then got to our side a number of Francophone African countries who had changed position.
Oh, I see.
I can tell you
they were no longer with their colonial master.
They understood that the game could easily be lost if they continue that way. And in fact, I can tell you that the day of the voting, we spent hours talking to heads of states, and I was with President Rawlings because he doesn't speak French. We spoke to President Bédier, and I thought that President Bédier Bédier of Cote d'Ivoire played a very key role in encouraging France to change course.
We will go on break.
Yes.
After the break, we'll continue our conversation later on with, I'm sure you are now intrigued by the insight of people who worked in this close team to make him the Secretary General of the United Nations. I'm sure you might also not think that this is an active partisan or somehow political engagement, and comes with a lot of lobbying to get people there. My guest is Ambassador Dike Osei. After this break, we'll continue our conversation. You're welcome to Upfront, and our conversation today is eulogizing the man Kofi Annan. Tomorrow, he will be put to rest for good and buried. But before then, you sure should know more about some of the things he did behind the scenes that was not public engagement to the eyes of everybody. Now, we are starting this conversation from how he got elected, and how he got elected with the man that was in the team that got him there. And this man is Ambassador Dike Osei. Ambassador Dike Osei was also former President John Kufuor's secretary. And I'm sure those of you who are in the circles of diplomacy appreciate and understand his competence and qualifications in that area. Ambassador, you're welcome.
Thank you.
So we are on the conversation of trying to unravel how he became, the things that went through. My last question to you was about who are the difficult people or difficult nuts to crack in our attempts to get him elected? And was it always going to be the case that the people felt he was the right person to be in there? In so doing, we are seeking to understand what are the inner workings of how we get somebody into that position.
It is a very long process. You first have to identify a candidate who is marketable. And then you first have to consult.
The same balance we use in our local politics.
Well, no, who will be diplomatically acceptable.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
In other words, who will be acceptable to your colleagues.
Okay.
Then you consult in the sub-region. You consult your colleague heads of states to see if they can back you. Then you consult the continental organization, the AU, to ensure that they are behind you. Then you consult the key players in the Security Council. By the time you finish this consultation, then you start a full-scale campaign. And that campaign requires visiting heads of states individually.
Individually?
Individually.
Really?
I mean, I can tell you...
I mean, you can divide them into groups and choose the ones that will be on the side, but all?
No, but we had 3 groups going.
Okay.
So, like, we took Africa.
Oh, okay.
I don't know where, but another group took Southern Africa. Another group took Europe. And like go to Brussels and so on and so forth. But we covered, I'm telling you, we covered as many African countries as possible. We did Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Burkina, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, Guinea, and so on and so forth. We went to Tunisia, Egypt, Libya.
Is it foreseeable that an African country or leader would support a non-African against an African?
Very easily.
Easily?
Easily.
But that will sound more like betrayal than any other thing.
But when I said then,
yeah.
But since then, we have a scheme which works. I mean, any candidate would have been selected on a basis of rotation. Like the sub-region will decide that for this position, it is up to a francophone from West Africa.
I see.
And then among them, they will select a person. Then there will be a resolution passed by the Assembly of Heads of States and Government.
They were all going to
supporting the candidate. That resolution then goes to the AU summit. Then the heads of states at the AU summit actually pass a resolution endorsing that candidate, the candidature. So by the time it gets there and you get the General Assembly, a representative for the AU actually is effectively in New York, ensuring that he's whipping everybody into line.
Oh, that's a much more improved system, actually.
It is. It's a better system.
But why haven't we had another Secretary General of the UN since then?
Because generally, if an African becomes UN Secretary General for 10 years, you should know that it's going to take a long...
Because there was Boutros before Kofi Annan.
But Boutros hadn't done 2 terms.
Oh, okay, 1 term, yeah.
And in fact, Kofi, strictly in stricto sensu, should not have been given 2 terms. But he had performed so well that they all agreed to come along.
When you say he had performed so well, some had actually made references to major blots in this administration.
Such as?
They're talking about how he could not stand the United States invasion of what they call it, Iraq, then how the major reforms he sought to introduce were dampened and made virtually to look like they were mere suggestions.
But on the contrary, I think that with the Iraq war, most of the difficulties he had as Secretary General came from the fact that he stood up to the Americans. And he asked the Americans to have the endorsement of the Security Council, which they didn't do. And he went public to say that the Americans could not go to war. And you remember, they tried to use the oil for food, money for involve the sun, and it didn't wash. And I think that given the position in which he was, given the fact that he was endorsed and supported by Americans to be Secretary General, many would not have acted the way he did, but he did.
I see. That's interesting.
And when you talk about reforms of the UN, I think that a close examination of what he did in terms of reforms, and a book I read recently said that he introduced 329 changes in the way the UN works. Now, talking about reforms, you recall the focus on MDGs.
Yeah.
But I think he introduced more radical reforms, which a lot of times we don't talk about. You know, cast your mind back to 1648, Westphalia, where sovereignty became one of the cardinal tenets of diplomacy, where it was understood that no country would interfere in the affairs of another country. Once R2P was introduced under the leadership of Kofi Annan, for the first time, the sovereignty of states, particularly states which were perceived to be terrorizing its own people, could easily have an external intervention which had international legal backing for the same time. So that, in my view, was a radical reform in terms of diplomatic practice. For the first time, the sovereignty of states was being questioned. And remember that we're coming from 1648 Westphalia.
Yeah.
Secondly, in terms of diplomatic practice, I think if you read most speeches these days, you see that there's a linkage that they're making between peace, security, and development.
Yes. And
Kofi would usually add human rights and the rule of law. You see, in diplomacy, for instance, in mediation, you are looking at usually producing political or legal outcomes if there's a conflict. I think the radical introduction of an extra component in Kofi's thinking, and which if you read his speeches, you will notice was that he thought consistently that merely dealing with the political or legal transformations would not necessarily resolve the root causes of the conflict. Yeah. So there should be a socioeconomic component to reduce poverty, to take care of diseases, which in my view was a very radical approach to conflict resolution.
How did he convince people about the Rwandan genocide? Some said he watched it happen.
You know,
he did very little.
I think that the two things.
Yeah.
You know, in the UN system, any important wireless message that goes to the head of the peacekeeping operations, a copy of that is sent to the Secretary General.
I see.
So that message, which came from the commander in Rwanda, talking about cache of arms and preparations to massacre, the Secretary General had a copy of it. It was Kofi's view, Uncle Kofi's view, then that the UN didn't have the resources to intervene in the manner which they were supposed to. At any rate, the primary responsibility lay with the Secretary General. Why didn't Boutros do anything about it? And Kofi has gone on to explain that with 300 men and without resources, with insufficient intelligence, it would have been suicidal after Somalia, when the American soldiers were seen being murdered left and right, to attempt any radical intervention with a poorly armed force of 300 persons. And I really think that it's been unfortunate that he's been accused of not doing as much as he could do in Rwanda. I don't know what anybody else could have done in Rwanda. Look at what happened in Bosnia, and look at the role he played in Haiti, and ensured that there was a smooth transition to normal democratic governance. I really think that posterity will look at all this and objectively say that it was not Kofi's fault.
It's interesting. This is perhaps the most comprehensive defense I've heard anybody put up for him in this case, because, to be fair, some have said that history clearly would not judge him right on that matter because huge number of people died. In fact, the explanation he sought to give, people still think that he didn't push hard enough. And when push came to shove, the African was not there for the African.
Circumstances.
Yeah.
Look at the context in which he was operating.
But did it come up in any of your rounds? Did it come up?
All the time.
Okay.
All the time. All the time. And the response was pretty clear that since he took over as head of peacekeeping operations, the system had been sanitized and there were many, many, many successes.
Okay.
And in fact, the interpretation of the commander of the forces in Rwanda and the source of his intelligence, which was the base of the facts which Uncle Kofi didn't act about, were suspicious. And I'm not sure that with the kind of force on the ground and the way the Interamwe were behaving, armed and all over the place, I'm not certain that in the circumstances he could have done very much.
It's interesting. That particular conversation, I'm sure, will still go on in the circles of diplomacy and interventions and how that reform was required. Absolutely. I mean, some said that that was the beginning of the expression non-intervention, rather being the case and not interference in this particular case, because we prefer non-intervention. We prefer intervention in this case than to interference at the end of the day. That's what many have said was the basis of saying.
You see, historically, the peacekeeping role in the UN had changed from A to B, non-intervention, at one point intervening, self-defense, etc., etc. But the real authority comes from the Security Council. The Secretary General, as an individual, as Uncle Kofi often says, Secretary General is like a scapegoat, not Secretary General. SG stands for scapegoat. And indeed, the Security Council should take responsibility for non-action in Rwanda. Because he, as Secretary General, could not first decide on peacekeeping, a larger force, or provide the resources for it. Why didn't the Security Council act? Why didn't the Secretary General act? You know, the buck didn't stop at his desk.
Now, the question I'm also interested in, and this question matters a lot because of the conversation that has come after that. The Almighty Security Council, his attempt to bring some major changes there, increase the number, make others participate in it, did not work.
Yes. I think the nature of the system of the Security Council, in my view, it's so undemocratic that as an individual, a Secretary General can only effect those changes if the permanent members so desire. Have you seen anybody who has so much power and wants to get rid of it? Do you see the U.S.?
Nobody gives up power easily.
No. So until the veto mechanism is dealt with in a comprehensive manner, a Secretary General cannot introduce those radical reforms. And he did his best. But in my view, no Secretary General can effect those changes until the 5 permanent members so decide.
They agree, and it's more like it's not going to ever happen.
Unfortunately, it's not looking very bright.
But not in the lifetime of the current leaders.
Well, we'll see. Kofi says change. He keeps saying that change occurs all the time and every change is possible. And I think that the way the world is getting a little more transformed, at some point or other, it will be in the interest of the permanent members to want to share power.
Now, let me get this. And there's a question that a young man asked me.
Yes.
what was the point? What did he do for Ghana anyway? How do you, people like you, answer this question?
I think that when you're not in diplomacy, and when you're not actively involved, it is unlikely that you will know what the Secretary General Kofi Annan was doing for Ghana. But I can tell you, in many of the negotiations, economic negotiations which were undertaken, the ground would have been wet for us before we leave Ghana.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yes. He was involved in everything. That, at the time I was Secretary President, Kofi was deeply engaged in the whole process of the discussions with the World Bank, with the fund, with India, with Brazil. And a lot of things happened in Ghana, partly because of the stature. But he couldn't, as Secretary General, publicly or openly be seen to be. And he would give us hints, and we would consult. In fact, he was in touch with President Kufuor all the time. Don't forget that even in the Kenyan crisis, it was President Kufuor who was AU chairman, and he asked Uncle Kofi to come and take over with Gracia Machel and President Kappa. Eventually, Kofi took over alone. So in terms of real diplomacy, why do you think we named the ICT Center after him?
I see.
Why do you think we named the Peacekeeping Center after him?
He was very instrumental in the country.
Extremely. Mobilizing resources and encouraging heads of states to provide assistance to Ghana. He did a lot for this country. In fact, there were times when he was doing some of the diplomacy for us. He would hint us that, look, at the next IMF meeting, you're unlikely to get what you want, so why don't you encourage them to postpone it for 3 months whilst you resolve maybe issues of labor rationalization or something like that. He was constantly guiding us and providing assistance and suggesting areas we could improve the economy. He was very, very supportive.
Oh, the impression I got from and for those who did not know some of these things, they'll be shocked to know that the international statesman cared about Ghana enough to have, but this was something he could have done for any party in office, not just because. Oh no, he would have done for any party in office. Yes, because
not because President Kufuor and him were born in Kumasi or knew each other. No.
No, okay.
Because in times when other parties have been in power, he has been as supportive as ever.
Oh, I see.
And each time we've had an election.
But this one looks like a more active involvement, helping with IMF points, giving hints, helping with economic engagements, pointing you to directions.
That continued when the NDC came to power.
I see.
Yes. Yes. You can talk to President Mahama.
I see.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes, and even he didn't stop there. President Mills was consulting him all the time. And I know one of President Mills' brothers, Cadman, who was constantly sending messages back and forth.
I see.
He did. He loves Ghana. In recent times, he's been still engaged with all the parties.
There's something you said about the late J.H. Spencer.
Yes.
That has become a very controversial talk, that he died a pauper.
Yeah.
Did Kofi Annan die a pauper?
No. No, first, let me add that statement was taken out of context.
I see.
And if you read all the whole paragraph, you'll understand what I was trying to say. I really wanted to say that he had very little regard for material things.
I see.
And didn't come out very, very well.
Oh, okay.
I knew him well. I lived with him. He was my uncle. And we worked together in government. And I can tell you that he had scanty regard for material things. And when he died, he didn't have the kind of money that others have. Kofi Annan did not die a pauper, because the salary of a UN Secretary General is not peanuts. And don't forget that Kofi started in the UN as P1, the lowest level of the senior ranks. And he worked his way from P1, P2, P3, P5, D1, D2. And now I can tell you a D2 salary, after 5-6 years in the UN, you are happy, you can retire peacefully. And as Secretary General, it was only about $1 million.
Really?
Yes.
I'm confused. A month?
No.
That would have been every year.
But don't forget, he had been in the UN for a long time.
That's true.
And UN salaries are not meager. So over the years, he had accumulated enough money. So I cannot imagine that Kofi would have no resource, because he'd worked well, he'd been paid well, and he's lived a decent life, frugal man. He's not like others who want to live like multimillionaires when they're not. But I don't think Kofi, no. He lived a good life.
We talk about legacy. We talk about how to immortalize him. Already we know the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center. We also know that Kofi Annan India ICT Center. That's also known. We will talk about the other things that ought to be done to cement this. But you seem to suggest he was a perfect man in office.
Oh, no. How could he be perfect?
Yes, that's what I want to know. What are some of the decisions that, I mean, you are a teacher of diplomacy. That did not really go well with you and others in the circles.
You know, I always said to him when we had one-on-one discussions that he was too diplomatic.
Too diplomatic?
And he said to me, but I'm a diplomat. And I thought that there were cases in which he could have been a little more forthright. Like in the Côte d'Ivoire crisis, there were times in which a word to the UN forces in Abidjan could have tilted the situation or could have stabilized the situation. But he was such a strict...
Could have led to an interference, not an intervention.
And he was very careful about that.
Okay.
And again, I thought that he was so international that a number of Africans accused him of not being sufficiently concerned about Africa.
Unlike his predecessor.
But because of his experience, you will see that all those who worked closely with him were not Africans. The only one who was close to him was Ambassador Hayford, who was Director of African Affairs. But many of those people he had worked with for years in the UN system. So some of those criticisms are unfair. Now, to talk about diplomatic practice, where I think Uncle Kofi could have done more. You see, there are layers of intervention. Let's take mediation, which was one of his greatest forte. I always thought that given the kind of mastery he had about conflict analysis of situations, having been in the UN for such a long time, he would be more concerned with procedure and format. But in the latter days, he became a bit impatient with dealing with procedure and format in mediations.
I see.
And I'll explain what I mean. For instance, when we arrived in Nairobi, after the election results and so on and so forth, and he arrived, he was not well. In fact, he had malaria, but he flew in from Geneva. And the moment he walked into the negotiation, there was a seat which was a little higher meant for President Kibaki. And Raila had a chair which was a little lower. Kofi, being a diplomat, immediately understood that the format of the meeting could endanger the end results of the negotiation.
Oh, because of the seat positions.
That's right. And so he had President Kibaki's chair changed to a similar chair to be used by Raila. But it took about 1.5 hours. He had such an eye, but I didn't see him doing that in many more occasions. He could have done more.
I see. That's interesting to know. Yeah, but it's a wonderful analysis that many would have ignored, how this would impact a wonderful conversation like that.
You know, in a negotiation, as you know, we have what we call pre-negotiation.
Yeah.
You start off by determining if there's a need to negotiate.
I see.
Before you even want to negotiate. Then you have to define what the content of the agenda will be at the negotiation, even before you start the negotiation, and the sequence of the agenda. Then you have to discuss the procedure you want to use. And you have to then discuss the format you want to use. Now, any negotiation which doesn't engage itself in this pre-negotiation process ends up being a failure.
Interesting.
And
do we know this as a state? Very well.
well, as a practitioner,
No, I'm talking about state Ghana.
well, when I have been involved,
Yes.
I have ensured that pre-negotiation takes precedence over round-the-table negotiations. Yes, sorry.
Because we have had a history of people saying that we are poor negotiators, we get bad deals, we don't end up actually winning any time on the table, and we always bring some not so reasonable deals back home. People have complained about how, and the worry is that we are supposed to have some of the finest.
But we have a difficulty. I have a difficulty with it. If you send negotiators to find out a deal, to get a deal for Ghana, who don't have the expertise or the experience, we will get a bad deal.
I see.
So, and there is expertise in this country who are seasoned mediators. Still, there are people here who have done this over and over and over and over and again, and who might not directly be involved, but whose advice can be sought. You know, I've dealt with conflict resolution in DRC, in Angola, in Togo, in Benin, in Cameroon, Bakassi, in Bongo, Stime, and in Congo, Brazzaville. And the people who have much more experience than I have. Mm-hmm. They're available. I've dealt with people who are excellent at negotiating project financing. And so on. We do have expertise. I think one of the difficulties we have is not using the talent that is available.
That's strange, because it always sounds to us that we always have to, let's say, for example, accede to the Chinese. We have to accede to other groupings like those in the Western world, right, because of the lack, or we are always told that there's vacuum. These are people trained over the period with extraordinary competence, and we seem to fall out, especially in the government space. The people, for example, we might have a team, a minister, a deputy minister, some other official from another institution joining on all of these people. Right. And all of them will go and come back with not so much of a wonderful deal.
You see, you can have a minister going, but you do have expertise which you can use. For instance, when we had a maritime dispute with Cote d'Ivoire, there were behind the scenes young, smart experts. But I had a student whose dissertation I supervised. Okay. And this is what he did. He eventually had an MPhil. I'm certain that the evidence and information he had was very useful to the negotiation team. And in any sector, every sector, we do have such information and such expertise, and we should use it.
The question I'll be asked whether we can and have in the nearest future, be it a decade or two from now, still put somebody as high as Kofi Annan.
In international circles, yes, my experience is that when a Ghanaian has become Secretary General of the UN, it's unlikely that another Ghanaian will be Secretary General for a long time.
Really?
That is so, because after Africa, they will look at Europe, and after Europe, they will look at Asia, and so on and so forth. Yeah. It's an unwritten code that you cannot have one region dominating for such a long time. So it's unlikely that we will have another Secretary General of the United States. But we have enough young talent to be able to reach very high heights. And I see some of them, even in the UN now.
I see.
In fact, the current president of the UN General Assembly, who's from Central South America. Okay. Her chief of staff is Ghanaian.
I see.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes, they've just started. It's Ghanaian. And he's been working in the UN for a long time. He's now D2. So we have plenty of people around. Plenty.
Legacy. I thought about ICT Center and also, right, but this was prior to his death.
Right.
What should we do to immortalize the man? More that should be done.
I think that what Uncle Kofi will appreciate most would be that there's a mechanism to ensure continuous training in the areas in which he excelled. In other words,
diplomacy.
Absolutely.
But there's Lesiad.
Lesiad is
don't say small because you recruit only small people.
Oh, no. Lesiad is doing a great job. Mm-hmm. But Lesiad is relatively small, mm-hmm, given the kind of training and continuous training
That's
which
required.
diplomats require.
I see.
I understand that the Foreign Service is about to inaugurate a training institute somewhere in East Legon,
Okay.
where there will be constant training of all officers, because diplomacy is an area in which the more you acquire, the more you need to learn.
I see.
And those at higher levels also need training all the time, just as much as those at the lower levels.
Lower levels.
And if we had some kind of mechanism to ensure that people are trained in the area in which he was most at ease, he would be a very happy man.
That's interesting. I mean, some have talked about naming the Kotoka International Airport after him. They say a coup d'etat guy's name is continuously a blot on our conscience.
You know, you're getting into an area which I'd rather not discuss.
but there's a suggestion for people about that important effigy. So if anybody comes into the country, I actually went to Ghana. When I stepped down at the Kofi Annan International Airport, they think that historically it will be a better and befitting representation of our nation than
I find the
Kotoka.
the situation very interesting, but this is the kind of decision which will be taken at a very high political level.
Yes, that's why I'm asking for your opinion.
My opinion is that this is a matter which should not be taken without extensive consultation with all parties, including the family of the late General Kotoka, including his colleagues, including the army, including the Volta region, including other stakeholders.
Really?
Oh yes. It's important that in trying to honor one person, you don't get a large segment of your society angry. I do not believe in coup d'etats.
Yeah.
And
so you would have supported and made a declaration in support of the attempt to make our society reflect more of peacekeeping than coup d'etat.
Fortunately, I have the privilege of not being involved in taking such a decision.
It's interesting. It's an interesting one. But I thought, if you were, would you have supported it? I want a yes or no from you whether you think it should be done.
Have you ever met a diplomat who gives a yes or no
That's
answer?
what my problem is. That's why I'm trying to get you out of the diplomatic circles.
You see, after about 40 years in this job, I find it very difficult because there are many, nothing is really gray or white.
Yeah.
There's a gray which looks like white, which looks like black. So
I see.
it is important that you express all those various views. I'm glad I don't have to take that decision.
Is it a difficult decision for anybody to take?
I think it will be difficult for politicians to take.
Well, it's interesting to look at all of this. But now, let me ask you, and I've gotten you to answer this question for me. How was it like as secretary to the president?
It was the most enriching experience I had.
Really?
You know, you are the ear and nose of the president. You sift through his correspondence and you deal with most of them, and most of it you don't even show the president.
I see.
Because they stop at your desk, then you decide which ones demand high-level decision-making. So you then, it was an extraordinary experience. So long as you don't get into politics and you make sure that the president's time is spent properly, you make sure he's briefed on every subject that he's going to talk about, you make sure that his time is used in a manner which will benefit the country, I enjoyed being secretary president. I really enjoyed it. And it was difficult. I was on my toes 24 hours a day. I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't leave the office when the president was in the office. I had to read every memo which came to him. I had to read every letter which was addressed to him, and a lot of them to be able to farm out responses.
Oh, you decided which one he ought to see. But that decision was not his.
If you want a secretary president who's not trained and just to be a messenger, then you don't have to appoint an ambassador secretary president. In fact, part of your duty is to ensure that the president is not overloaded. And that's why I've always thought that it's better to have somebody with public service experience and preferably with a tinge of diplomatic training to be able to do that job.
Okay.
Before I came to that job, I was already A1. So I'd been in the public service for 27 years then. You see, because you're supposed to run the office efficiently. And many of the things which come to president really don't need to. They're intended for other ministers. or other state organizations or Attorney General's Department, and you make a judgment and say, look, but of course, those which require this decision, you place on his desk. But in a day, if you receive 140 letters, he would see only about 10 of them. Because when you work with the president for about 3 months, you know him.
Okay.
And again, I've known President Kufuor since I was a little boy. And we'd had discussions about finance, about currency, about politics when I was a little boy. So I knew him reasonably well to be able to assist him in running his office.
So if the president is overburdened, then it will be the responsibility of the secretary to the president.
It is, absolutely. Because part of your duty is to be his gatekeeper and to protect him from being overburdened. I mean, the most precious thing in the presidency is the president's time.
So if, for example, so many schools are inviting the president to come and do speeches at their speech and prize giving day, would you turn this down?
No, it depends on what time, what kind of prize giving it is, where the school is located, the president's own political preferences, and the relevance, or maybe you're looking for a platform for a major announcement on an education policy. There are many considerations, and usually those decisions will be taken at a forum every Monday. We will discuss with the chief advisor, the chief of staff, and the secretary cabinet, and with the president present, discuss all that is available and the choices that are made. In between, until the next meeting, you then take those decisions.
That must be a very extremely weary job. You have to go through virtually every letter and you do it.
And receive all calls on his behalf.
Oh, you do so too?
Yes, because first you have to sift. You cannot allow everybody to talk to the president because he doesn't have time. So if another head of state wants to talk to him, they'll first call you.
Oh, okay.
And then you decide
whether that call ought to be put through to the president.
Then or not.
You are the eyes of the president.
Absolutely. Actually. Absolutely. You must work to make sure that he's efficient.
Was there anything you heard from the president that legitimately you were supposed to see? As in your very experience with President
That I held away from.
Yes, that he was supposed to see.
If it was something to do with an important decision, I would not hold away from him.
I see.
No. Because you are not supposed to take the major decisions. You're really a public servant supposed to be running and managing the office.
There's a question, and this is important because there's currently a conversation in this country about the president being virtually overburdened. Every single day he's at a different event. Sometimes he travels out of the country, and there's money, he's in a different program, and all of that. Is that a worry? Will there be a problem with the structures that allow that to be? Or will it be the preference of the president to say that I want to be out there?
You see, that really is a choice of the president.
I see.
But a lot of that has to do with the kind of structure or organization he sets up. In my view, there should be only one central point of authority in determining the president's time. When there are 3, 4, 5 people all having a say in which meetings the president should have, there's always a lot of confusion. But of course, the final say should be left to the president. But it is your duty as secretary to the president, for the little space you have, to ensure that even when he wants to go, if you think that it is not good for his health, you should find a way of discouraging him.
Ambassador Dike Osei, I am grateful I've had you today. I'm sure this engagement should be consistent. We are happy to have learned a lot from you. And thank you so much for coming today.
Pleasure.
Folks,
thanks for having me.
That's where we end today's edition of Upfront. My guest was Ambassador Dike Osei, Secretary to the former President John Kufuor. Very wonderful conversation. I enjoyed it. I hope you did too. And let's do so again tomorrow.